Hi, everybody, and welcome to the live late launch of How to Live Like a Monk. And one of the things that is really exciting about technology is that it can sometimes work towards our advantage and it can sometimes be a bit of an issue. So, welcome, everybody. You'll notice that it's just me, Danièle Cybulskie, for the moment. Poor Helen Castor is having a little bit of technological problems, but I'm hoping she'll join us later. She's on top of it. She's trying to fix things right now. So welcome, everybody. I see there are a couple people joining us already from YouTube and from Facebook. So thanks for joining me. I'm going to be talking about the book until Helen gets here. And of course, we know that over the course of this live broadcast, I'm going to be answering your questions and I'm going to be giving away a couple of books. So that's exciting for me and hopefully it's exciting for you too. So welcome, everybody. If you want to take a second in the chat to tell me what kind of stuff you're hoping to get from this live broadcast, that would be great. And you can just say hello in the chat as well. I'm so happy to see everybody here. So I'm figuring that one of the things that you want to find out from me, if you haven't already read the book, is how did the book come about? And I have to say that when I was pitched this book, I was actually pitched this book from Abbeville Press, and specifically Lauren Buca, who is an editor there. She was mentioning that it would be great to write a book about monastic life and how it would apply to life today. And when she pitched this book to me, I thought it was a great idea, but I had no idea that we were going to be reliving the 14th century so quickly and so thoroughly. So when I wrote this book, I wasn't expecting it to be so handy in terms of finding ways to live a life that is healthy and hopefully encourages more wellness. So if you've already read the book, you'll know that there's a huge focus on wellness and living well. That's what the book is about. And hopefully it's given you some tips that are helpful, especially because the world right now is a little bit mad. I want to say hi to everyone from Chicago. We got Chicago in the house. We got Texas, New Hampshire. Thanks everybody for being here. New Brunswick. Yes, it's snowing in New Brunswick. It was snowing in Ontario moments ago too. All right. So do you want to leave a message in the chat for me and tell me what you want to know? You can start asking me questions now while we wait for Helen to troubleshoot. Good mornings to the people in Seattle as well. So Helen is coming. She's going to be on any second. Here she is. Helen is here. I'm going to add her to the broadcast. Hi,
Helen. So sorry, but I'm here.
So good to see you. So good to see you. I'm sorry.
Lovely to see you too.
This is what happens when you get medievalists working with technology.
This medievalist, you're a wonder with technology. I am hopeless and I'm so sorry everyone.
That's okay. People are just starting to join us now, Helen. So why don't we pretend that we're starting from the beginning? Want to start from the beginning?
Lovely. Absolutely. You haven't seen us before this. We're entering the room now and we can start from scratch.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, so shall I
take it away?
Hello, I'm Helen Castor and I'm a medieval historian, and it is my enormous pleasure to welcome everyone to the fashionably late launch of this wonderful book, How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life by Danièle Cybulskie. Now, I'm lucky enough to call Danièle a friend, but much more importantly today, she is a remarkable historian and one of my very favourite interpreters of the Middle Ages. There is no better person to give you a sense of what it was actually like to live in the medieval world. You can find her work in every good bookshop as the author not only of this beautiful thing, but also of Life in Medieval Europe, Fact and Fiction, of the 5-Minute Medievalist, which is how many of us know her on Twitter and other places as well, and the 5-Minute Medievalist Guide to Surviving the Zombie Apocalypse, which I'm really hoping we won't need in the immediate future. And you can also find her all over the World Wide Web as the creator and host of the Medieval Podcast, a regular contributor to medievalist.net, and running the Medieval Masterclass for Creators, which is a very, very wonderful thing. Danièle, hello and congratulations on the book.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I have to say, you were a hero of mine for many years before we actually met. And so you've said to me before that you actually read my books, and that is just a personal achievement for me. So thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure and my privilege. I have learned so much from reading your books. I think one of the things I've said to you before that academic historians don't always do, and that's my background long ago, we don't think about what it's actually like to be in the medieval world. And I open your books and the sights and the sounds and the smells are right there. It's absolutely extraordinary. But to launch this one, we thought we would have a chat about the book to start with, about 20 minutes or so of us talking. And then we're going to want some questions from you out there. So please do, as we talk, let us know what you want to know in the chat. Then later on, there will be some prizes to be won, which Danielle is going to tell us about. And I think she has a very special announcement for us later on as well. So please stay with us for that. But Danielle, the first thing I wanted to ask you is that when we're thinking about how to go about living in this modern world, living like a medieval monk isn't necessarily the first thing that comes to mind. So where did the idea come from for you to put these two things together?
Yeah. So actually, I was just saying this before you came on. The idea came from Abbeville Press itself. So Lauren Book is an editor there, and she had been thinking about this idea for a long time. And she brought it to me, and I thought this was very exciting because I didn't know a huge amount about monks, and I wanted to learn. And I'm a person that's always pushing myself to learn more about everything. And I also really like to read self-help books. I like to read about wellness. I like to read about psychology. I think all that stuff is very exciting. So when she pitched this idea to me about bringing these things together, that was just a really exciting concept. And what was interesting was it was 2 years ago in February that she pitched this to me. And at the time, we had no idea what was coming for us. It was 2020. And we went back and forth on email a little bit because I wanted to make sure we were on the same page, that we would be treating this as a respectful kind of tribute to these people, because there are so many trite wellness books and so many trite religious books. And these are people that spent their whole lives doing this. I really wanted to be respectful. And so Lauren and I took a few weeks to try and make sure we were on the same page. And just as we decided the book was going to go forward, COVID-19 hit.
Whoa, that's quite something.
We weren't sure if the book was going to go forward because of that. But as it turned out, it did. And so that gave me a lot of thinking to do about living by yourself, about the importance of community. And all of these things kind of came to the fore in a way they probably wouldn't have if I'd written it not in the middle of COVID-19.
So that's an extraordinary experience to be going through for you, and then to be bringing to this project. I mean, maybe that would lead us into the next question that I wanted to ask, because we all know what we've been living through for the last 2 years. But before we get to the detail, the nitty-gritty of what the medieval monks might have to say to us through you, can you give us an outline, just so we know where we are, of what exactly it meant to be a monk? Yeah. And what a typical day might look like if you were one, so that we know where we're starting from?
Yeah, it seems like a simple question because we see monks all over the place. We see them on TV and movies and stuff, but it's actually a very specific thing. So a monk is somebody who lives in a cloister, monastery, abbey. These things are kind of interchangeable. We tend to think of cloister being a nunnery now and a monastery being where monks are, but they were interchangeable, as you know, back in the day. So these are people that lived within a cloister, and they didn't have a whole lot of contact with the outside world. This was to allow them to devote all their time. So this is different from friars, who would sometimes live in a cloister, but they would go out into the community and preach.
So we're not talking about the public facing, the going out and living. We're talking about the enclosed, the men and women who chose to live in an enclosed community.
That's right. So the people who are actual monks are Benedictines, Cluniacs, Cistercians. The people that are friars are Franciscans, Augustinians, etc., Dominicans. So they're separate, but they kind of work together. So a monk is going to be spending his day working and praying and living in community. And he's going to rotate this stuff over the course of the day. So wakes up and prays, then has a chapter meeting where they get together, they talk about the monastic business. Anybody who has big sins to confess to the community can do it at that time. They go back to praying, they'll eat, and then they'll have work, and they'll have reading to do during the course of the day. So it's a lot of praying, a lot of singing, but also work and reading and taking breaks as well. So
So there's a lot there for us then to start thinking about. The first way into what that day contained, though, that I was very struck by, I mean, partly just coming in from the beginning of the book, I don't know if it's the camera is picking up this beautiful green that
Yeah.
is here in the lettering. And as soon as you open the book, the end papers are this gorgeous, peaceful green. And what surprised me, having been very struck just by how beautiful it is, getting into the book, there's an awful lot of green and greenness within the text as well. So could you tell us a bit about what green and greenness in all its senses meant to medieval monks and how that might be food for thought for us now?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a good moment to give a shout out to Anna Lobanova, who did the little monk woodcuts, which I absolutely adore. If I was to get a tattoo, it would be one of these guys.
You're looking at I was, this is such a beautiful cover, and then you spot this chap down here who's on his little scooter, and you realize this is a very unusual book. It's wonderful. Sorry, do go.
That's all right. That's all right. I did start with greenness because I think a lot of people actually come to monks through mystery novels. In mystery novels, there's always a garden, right? And so when you think about monks, there's also this idea of using plants for medicinal purposes, using them to heal, using them to just have a really healthy way of living as well. They did eat a lot of bread. It's not the most healthy lifestyle, a lot of bread, a lot of beer, a lot of wine, but they really depended on plants for things like healing. And what was cool about learning that was there are things I've looked at before, like things like white willow bark has the same components that we make artificially as aspirin. So that kind of stuff is very exciting. But I also came across a few other things like fennel, which is in the alphabet of Galen as being useful for eye complaints, is something in fennel is still used to treat pink eye. So that was an experience to learn. Yeah, so conjunctivitis. So yeah, that was cool. But also the monks have green in the very heart of their cloister. So the cloister is usually 4 walls around a central garth, which is meant to be a lawn. It's meant to be green. And part of that reason was they believed that green would refresh your eyes. And they believe this. There's William Auvergne, I think, said that it's because green is halfway between black and white. And that's why it's so refreshing. But diving into the science that we know now, green is really helpful in treating things like depression. If you see a plant, you feel a little bit happier. And I mentioned this on the podcast this week because I think it's one of the most useful and easiest things we can do for ourselves is to have a fake house plant and it'll still make you feel better. If you have a picture of a house plant, it'll still make you feel better. So green and greenness and plants are a huge part of monastic life. And that seemed like a good place to start the whole thing.
So a kind of nourishment that is literal in terms of food and then medicinal, but it's much more holistic than that for the monks and for us.
Yes, yes, it's still useful to us in the same way, both healing our souls and actually healing our bodies. So that was a cool place to start the book.
And then if we think about the stereotypes that might come to mind when we're thinking about medieval monks, in popular culture or whatever, there's the whole question of too much and too little, that we might think of monks in terms of deprivation. We think of vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience, giving things up, bodily wants and pleasures, and so on. And then on the other hand, we hear bawdy tales of monks getting up to all sorts of stuff they shouldn't, and drinking too much and eating too much, great, larger than life people. So what's the real story between excess and deprivation? What are we thinking about in terms of a monastic life?
That is a great question. So the ideal is deprivation for the most part, and especially for Saint Benedict, but very few monastic communities really stuck to Saint Benedict to the letter. In fact, so few people did that in terms of Benedictine houses that the Cistercians went back to that. They were like, we need to really stick to Saint Benedict's rule because everyone is just relaxing this too much. And it's because what St. Benedict is asking of people is extremely difficult. He's asking them to have like 2 outfits. That's it. He's asking them to be silent almost the entire day if they can do it. He's asking them to eat very little. And we know that humans can't really do that. And so we can see when we look at some of the ways that people are complaining about monasteries, tell us that they're relaxing the rules a little bit. And so that's interesting when you see people complaining, like there's too much frivolity, there's too much food. They're not even supposed to eat quadrupeds, but you have, as you say, these big stereotypical monks who are a bit rounder than they're meant to be. So there's that. You do see that in complaints. But what was really interesting to me was especially this text called The Dialogue on Miracles by Caesarius of Heisterbach. And that one just tells stories of different monks and their experience. And what he really cautions is moderation. So he has several stories in there that say, we told this person to be moderate. They really over fasted, or they prayed too much, or they didn't take breaks. And it actually hurt their mental health, that they were almost suicidal, or they were suicidal in one case. So he's saying you need to back off from that. And one of the other interesting sources was using the Anchoran rule. So anchorites are people who take this to the extreme. They're hermits, like urban hermits. And what I saw in the Anchoran rule, or the Anchoran was that moderation is, again, really, really what is meant to be thought of, because if you fast too much or you pray too much, you'll just burn out, and then you can't take care of that, take care of yourself. And so that was really resonant to me. I think in the modern period, we are all pushing ourselves to burnout. And so that really spoke to me, the idea of these people with the most austere lifestyle in the Middle Ages are telling us to be moderate. Maybe we should think about that.
Maybe we should, as you say, given the busyness of what we certainly used to think of as normal life, but then the need to pace ourselves, whether it's through that busyness or through what we've all been going through in the last 2 years. How do we pace ourselves when life is more restricted? So I'm really interested by this idea that actually there is such a thing as too much deprivation for even a kind of life that is built around not having what you want all the time.
Yeah.
And that, as you say, seems like wisdom we can learn from. There were little details that came up. I mean, monks are extremely good at brewing beer, aren't they? Can you tell us why
Yes.
that association comes to be and how they avoided being drunk the whole time?
Well, they didn't always. We do have examples of penance that's given to monks, and there's actually degrees of penance. Like if you're hungover, that's not great. If you throw up, you get penance for that. If you throw up the host, you're really in trouble, and you have to do a lot of penance. So
I can imagine, yeah. But they're envisaging that it's possible. Somebody might do this dreadful thing of throwing up the host.
yes, yeah. So there's penance designed for that, which means that, yeah, they've come across this before. They have to write it down. So there's an expectation there's going to be some excess sometimes. And actually, in the Observances of Barnwell Priory, which is a text that I use because it's very detailed, even though it's Augustinian, they are suggesting people live in cloister all the time. So I thought this was kind of comparable. They mentioned that if you're hungover, you should use the same cures that you do if you're depressed. So go for walks, talk with friends, take some time off. So it is kind of a little bit of permissibility to overindulge. But monks are really connected with brewing. And in part, this is because they were brewing for the community. So as you know, people were brewing at home, women are brewing at home, and they sold the leftovers. And this is what's happening with monks too. They're brewing for the community because it was a really just common drink for everybody, although they still did drink water. And then they would sell the excess, which is useful. And so we still have this connection with monks and brewing because they could do it on a larger scale and sell it as well. But my friend Nicole Phillips, who's written the book on beer lately, which is Craft Beer and Medievalism, talks about how Trappist beers have a medieval connection, but they're actually from the 19th century because monasteries were not part of Belgian culture for a little while, and then they were brought back again. So
okay, so we have to be careful of the things that we think are immediately obvious. But what you've just said about brewing and selling to the community brings me to the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the relationship between the inward life and the outward life, because clearly these are religious communities, and some of us are religious today and some of us are not. But that idea of inward reflection is something that's very powerful in the book, and what that can do for us. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, even these communities that were committed to living as, in some sense, enclosed communities, they did look outward as well, didn't they? Could you tell us a little bit about how that worked and the balance and what we might want to think about?
Yeah, I think that this idea of looking outward, and that's one of the reasons I I titled that chapter Looking Outward, was to do with service. So I think you can't really be a Christian, I think, without thinking about service. It's really part of that religion, just in general. And so when they're thinking about what to do with their lives, it's always about service, and hopefully servicing, like giving a service to the community. Said that wrong. Serving the community, also serving the community at large, so not just people within the monastery, but without. So we see this through a bunch of things. They were in charge of education, so they were bringing people in to educate them, especially boys. You did see some girls getting educated, but usually if they were going to become nuns themselves, like it wasn't education for a later career type thing. So education was one way, and also chronicling, which is so important for us as historians, right? The idea of chronicling and keeping track of what's going on in the monastery and outside of the monastery as well.
I don't know if you can hear that, but there's clearly an emergency outside my house now. I do apologize for sirens going past it.
Speaking of serving the community.
Exactly.
First responders.
Sorry, I interrupted. So this sense of looking out and hospitality too, a responsibility to lay people around them, hospitality and medicine too.
Yeah, that's right. So hospitality is one of the first things that they are required to do. So they were meant to treat every stranger as Jesus come again. And this is to the point that where the abbot is supposed to actually wash the stranger's feet. Now, is this practical? Not really, because you have people that are traveling in and out all the time. So the abbot's probably busy doing other things, but hospitality is a main part of the monastery. And so there were places where they would be housing guests. And you're supposed to donate if you're a guest. And one of the things I have in the book is Prince John, or King John, just after he has won the crown or inherited the crown, he visits Bury St. Edmunds and leaves the worst tip ever. And it makes it into the chronicle because it's so terrible. So there's that. There is hospitality, and then related to that, hospitality in terms of medicine, as you're getting at. So the first hospitals, usually run by monks and nuns, because they were serving the community. Now they would serve pretty much everybody, and in the Holy Land you see them serving Jews and Muslims as well. But part of their hospitality and ministering and their medical treatment was actually religious treatment. So if you went there, you'd also have some lessons in Christian life too, which you may not want. That was part of their healing, because they felt that spiritual healing was more important than bodily healing. But it's all part of service in this outreach. So even though they're cloistered, they're always thinking of how to help other people.
So it's thinking in those two directions all the time, thinking about how to nourish and serve inwardly, and whatever that means to us spiritually, but also then thinking about our relations with others and how to balance up those needs.
That's right. And it's not mutually exclusive. And one of the things that I learned, I was reading a lot of Tal Ben-Shahar's work. So this is the guy who taught them one of the most popular courses at Harvard ever on happiness. So he's an expert on happiness. And the stuff that he's discovered is that people are happiest when they're living within their values and when they're helping other people. And so for monks, it's kind of easy because it's one to them. Serving other people is part of their spiritual mission. So it was easy for them to align. So I hope that a lot of monks found happiness in that way, because their service and their personal values were aligned. So that was something I think was thinking about in modern terms as well. How many of us know what our purpose is? How many of us know what our values are? And once we start living towards those values, we may find more happiness in the way that I hope that monks did.
And it's a very important point you're pointing at, isn't it? That there can be too easy an assumption that we have to choose between altruism and looking after other people and looking after number one. But actually, as you're saying, there's a very powerful way in which looking after other people can be the same as looking after oneself, if one gets the balance right and thinks about what one has to offer.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, my mom, who's probably watching and might be embarrassed that I say this, whenever she's getting angry or upset or she's getting into a funk, she does something nice for someone else and that helps her. And we know that through scientific research, that actually helps people feel better. You can't help someone else without feeling better yourself. And that's a wonderful thing to come across, and something I think monks would appreciate that we've discovered since then.
Absolutely. It's talking of who might be out there. It's not too long before I need to see what questions are coming in. But just before I hand over, what surprised you in the research for this book? Did anything surprise you?
I think it was the idea of moderation. And I talked about this a little bit on this week's podcast as well, especially when I was reading the Anchorin Rule. I was thinking about anchorites being these huge spiritual athletes, the ones with the most austere life. They're supposed to be praying all the time. And I think the thing that surprised me most was when the bishop who's writing it says, sometimes it's more important to read than it is to pray. And I just thought, wow, this is amazing, because I thought they were just supposed to pray all the time, like pushing out words. But one of the reasons that he gives is that reading is pleasurable. It kind of replenishes your spirit. So reading can help you do your work better. And so sometimes it's more important to read than to pray. And I think that was the most surprising thing that I learned. But also the reinforcement of things like when you set a monastic standard so high, people aren't going to reach that all the time. They just can't. It's too hard to be good all the time. Santa Claus knows this, right? It's too hard to be good all the time. So that allowance that they had for people who are experiencing that specific isolation and monastic depression called asceti, giving them the ability to go and take time off, go and sit with your friends and talk a little bit or take a walk. These things will help you. And so seeing that built-in compassion for people who are struggling with this, huge goal that they have for themselves was validating, maybe not surprising.
An understanding of humanity, that
Yeah.
it isn't about anything less than perfection is not good enough.
Yeah.
It's, you are human, and therefore striving in a way that makes allowance for
Yeah.
humanness.
Yeah, strive every day. And in fact, I was rereading the book this morning in preparation, and there was one good section. Again, it's from the Anchorin Rule, probably because they have such a difficult life. You do see these little bits of moderation in there, saying something like the tower is no longer under siege if it's already won. So if you're struggling, it means that you're still in it. You're still in the game. So that was really a good moment for me, I think, especially writing this through COVID-19, where the battle's not won if the tower is still under siege. So that really spoke to me too, I think.
Yeah. It's powerful stuff, isn't it? It
Yeah.
really is. I'm just going to have a look and see what's coming in the way of questions. There's one from Angela Bliss here saying, what was I mean, you may already say you've just answered it. What was the most personally meaningful thing you learned in writing this book? Is there anything, you mentioned your mum, but is there anything that really specifically spoke to you that you're prepared to share with us?
I think that there were moments like the one about the tower where you're writing these things, and writing is work, right? Researching is work.
Yeah.
And when you come across this type of stuff, that makes you take a second and just go, this is we've all experienced these things. It's okay to just be burnt out for a minute. How do we deal with this? We should give each other compassion. So those moments were really meaningful to me. And actually the whole book is really meaningful because I'm always trying to better myself. I'm always trying to make life better for myself and other people, hopefully. And so I've read about things like meditation, things like living well. I'm not very good at eating well. That's still an Achilles heel for me. But most of the stuff that you find in this book, things like minimalism, things like moderation, things like meditation, these are all things that are meaningful to me, that have helped me improve my life. So those things are meaningful in that I'm bringing them to you because they've been helpful to me. And it was meaningful to see this personal growth that I've done reflected back, 1,000 years ago. That was a meaningful thing. It was the stuff that's in here about living well is so resonant that you do feel, as you were talking about earlier, you do feel a connection and a kinship with people who you've never met, will never meet. So yeah, so that was very meaningful to me in the process.
I'm looking through the comment, and we've got some lovely comments, people saying how much they love the podcast and how much they're enjoying hearing you talk. Moderation as a theme, very Emily Nichols says, when you talked about moderation, that's when I thought about my mum. Moderation was her big message for us as teens. And of course, moderation, it's one of those things, it takes some work, doesn't it? Often, particularly when one is exploring one's life. So that sense of restriction and freedom
Mhm.
is a big question for monks, and differently for us, isn't it? That sense, if you're in the same place the whole time and every day is supposed to go according to the same routine, the same order, you get up at the same time every day, you do the same thing, that sounds very restrictive. But in the sources you were reading, the accounts you were reading, do medieval monks talk or think about freedom, or is that a very modern preoccupation?
Hmm. That's a good question. Do they think about freedom? I don't think they think about freedom in the same way that we do, where freedom is paramount. So if you're joining a monastery, you're already buying into the idea that you are giving yourself up to God. So obedience is one of the vows that you take. So you're wearing the same clothes every day that are the same as everybody else. You're offering up your ego. So I don't think that they think about freedom or prioritize it in the same way that we do, or that independence or that expressing yourself, because that's what they're going in. That's the life that they've chosen, is one that doesn't have that. But do they long for more choice than they have? Possibly. Do they long for more sleep? Absolutely. Absolutely. You see monks that are getting in trouble. In the Benedictine rule, it says that, if you roll down from bed late, they're going to make you stand at the back of the church because you slept in. You're going to be personally shamed.
Discipline, there are consequences.
That's right. But thinking about Emily, who is kindly stage managing this all for us. So shout out to Emily. One of the things that I think about when we think about teenagers and moderation and restriction is sometimes we have to do things that are hard. And those are the things that are still good for us, right? So sometimes we have to do the things we don't want to do. We have to eat well, we have to exercise. And sometimes meditation is a struggle for people who still want to do it. So having to do these things is not freedom in that you've made rules or you have to follow these rules, but it will lead to a better life overall. And so I
A
think,
different kind of freedom, perhaps. I mean, that if your body is healthy and can do things that you want it to be able to do, that's a kind of freedom that you might not get if you haven't eaten well and done exercise and all you've had a different kind of freedom to not look after yourself, but it doesn't get you to the same place.
yeah, you have to put in the work and the discipline first. So I think that's probably what probably what Emily's mom is also getting at. Like, you have to put in the work if you want to have that freedom as well.
There's a really interesting question just come in via Facebook from Robert. Are monks allowed to have friends? Can they have friends outside the monastery?
Yeah, monks can have friends. And what's really interesting about this, it's not in the book, is sometimes we see friendships and relationships, actual romantic relationships that are described as friendships. So we do see this in the monastery. And I think this is a really important thing to remember, especially when we're trying to find the traces of LGBTQ history, which is really hard to find. Sometimes we see things couched in friendship as a way of protecting these people when it's really a romantic relationship, which you can see very clearly by the way they write about their friends. But you are allowed to have friends. And when we were talking a little bit about the cures for hangover or the cures for depression, one of the things is to take a friend of yours and to go for a walk with them. And you get to have some time off when you have your blood let to help you be healthier. You get to have a little bit of time off in the infirmary, and you get to talk with friends. You don't have to stick to that vow of silence the way you did before. So there's an expectation that people will have friends, but you should have friends within the monastery, especially because you're not supposed to leave it without permission. So it's going to be really hard to see your friends outside. St. Benedict says people can write you letters, but we have to read them first, and then we can decide if you should get them or not. So it's hard to have friends outside of the monastery. But people definitely had friends within the monastery, especially because they are the only ones who can understand what it's like to be there. Right?
So it's not that you're supposed to only subsist on the love of God, crucial though that is to the functioning of the monastery. There again, an understanding of the human need for companionship of some kind within the discipline of the order.
Yeah. And I think what's implicit in the idea of, if you're having a hard time, talk with your friends, the idea that discussion with your friends or just letting your feelings out with your friends is going to help. So yeah, friendship is important too, even though it may not always be explicit in the actual rules themselves.
Um, Sheila Begg asks, were there any monks who didn't have a choice or were just expected to join this kind of life? In other words, was everybody there of their own volition, or did anyone just get packed off and have to make the best of it?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and I'm glad that you asked it because I think there's an impression that you get shoved in there, you're there for life. There were oblates, and I'm hoping I'm saying that right. I've only ever read this word, but oblates are children that are given to the monastery. And the problem with that is these children don't have a choice. And that idea of consent and choice is actually really important to the church at the time, which people might not recognize, but it is. So oblates were given to the church not as a sacrifice, like a human sacrifice. This is going to get us into heaven, but as an opportunity for that kid to go places. And perhaps they couldn't be fed or they're orphans or something. There's a whole bunch of reasons that you could give a child to the monastery. And those oblates were expected to become monks when they got older. Now, in the Middle Ages, because there was this problem with not having choice or free will in that, I think it was the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. They said no more oblation. Anyone who is raised in the monastery still has to make the choice to be a monk. It's not like do not pass go. You have to stop and have a choice. So many people who were raised in the church could leave as teenagers. And if they decide to stay, they would stay.
This is
So,
very interesting because it's also the time when the church is making similar rules about marriage, isn't it?
yeah,
Setting a lower limit on when children, young people could be deemed to have, of their own will, entered into a marriage. And the ages are young from our point of view, but they're grappling with this problem of what consent is when you're making irrevocable choices about the way your life is going to go. So what kind of age was set for when you had to make that choice, which way you were going to jump into a monastery?
I could be wrong about this, but I think it's around 16.
Right.
And that's pretty normal for people who are being educated anyway. Like that's kind of the end of your education where you can continue it on or become an apprentice or continue with university after that. But I think it's around 16 that you'd be expected to make the choice.
And that's not so different from the kinds of ages that we now put on those life-changing decisions, isn't it? I mean, it was a bit younger for marriage. It was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, I think. But obviously most people got married after that anyway. But no, this is and thinking of that. Just another follow-up question. I know you've talked about the fact that there are communities of women and communities of men. So this is a life that does apply to both sexes. But did you come across any part of your research where you felt that nuns were having a decisively different experience from monks? Vice versa, I mean, whichever way around that.
Yeah, their experience was different in a lot of interesting ways. So first of all, what I should mention is sometimes you would have joint houses, men and women. And often in those houses, like Fontevraud, you would have an abbess in charge, not an abbot. So the abbess would be in charge of everybody, which is really interesting. They were thought of as having good administrative skills, which we may not expect. But I think a big difference is because the monastery is educating boys, you might have people who are introduced to that life early on through education, through oblation, if it's very early on. And so they're kind of growing up in the monastery and they might join later to decide to be monks. But I have the sense, and you can tell me if you have that sense too, that a convent, a nunnery, a monastery, however you want to say it for the nuns, they had a lot of people who are older, widows. I think, and I don't have statistics on this, but I think that there are more women who are older that are joining this, and they're joining it because they don't want to be married again. This is a place where they can hang out with women. They don't have the pressure of marriage. They don't have to have children because they don't. I think they were using some sort of birth control, but it wasn't super effective. So they could decide not to have children, and they could also further their education because everybody, both monks and nuns, were expected to know how to read. So a woman that had paid her dues, if she didn't really like marriage, she could join a nunnery, convent, monastery, and continue her education and really explore that side of herself.
Or perhaps even if she had enjoyed her marriage and family in some way, but now wanted a different kind of life, and perhaps to lead, as you say, the life of the mind a bit more, or time for herself and her faith and her intellectual life in a very different way. Whereas, as you say, you don't get many men coming in at that stage of life, because they don't have that change of status in the same way that women do if a marriage has, if they've been widowed or something like that.
Yeah, that's the sense of it I have. And I mean, I would have to look at statistics. I don't have those at my fingertips, but that is the sense that I get, that the demographic might skew older for nuns, but their day-to-day life is very similar, is meant to be very similar. And they're all right with that.
And we should emphasize, or something that I have to remind myself, that when we think, for example, as you say, of education and intellectual life, if we think, for example, of scribes and the copying of these beautiful manuscripts that have come to, and that is something to say about the book. It is so beautiful. The illustrations that you have to accompany your text are so beautiful and so evocative, and it is just a beautiful visual object. But that there were women scribes, maybe not as many as men, but that women were part of that visual and intellectual culture in a way that we don't always remember.
Yeah, absolutely. And the exciting discovery that was made a couple of years ago was of a nun. They found paint in the calcium of her teeth, or the calculus of her teeth. And they discovered that this is good proof, or almost proof, that this woman is a painter. And she was putting a paintbrush in her mouth and she was illustrating as well.
It just takes you back to that moment, doesn't it? I'm going to ask you to tell us about the prizes in 1 second. We have one more interesting question that's just come in. Do you want to tell us about the prizes before that, or should we come to the prizes after this last question?
Well, I'll tell you that the prizes are 3 copies of the book, and I will send them to anybody, anywhere, and I will sign them with whatever message they want. So what you have to do to enter this giveaway is to give us an emoji or one word that tells us about what wellness means to you. So it could be related to monks, it could be unrelated to monks, but give us an emoji or one word answer that tells us about what wellness means to you. And Emily is going to pick a random 3 winners, and I will send a book to them anywhere. So go for it. I think on Twitter, they can't see our comments, but Peter from medievalist.net is keeping an eye on Twitter. So if you're on Twitter, you can also give us emojis or one word. Okay, so getting to the question.
This is all beyond me, but the technological marvels of all of this, I think I would have been more at home in a medieval monastery from this point of view. Tara, will you or have you ever spent a lengthy time at a monastery? And if so, how was your experience?
I haven't spent a lot of time there. I haven't spent a lot of time there, but I visited ruins of medieval ones. So I would love to go to one, perhaps in Belgium, that's a living monastery. You have people that are still practicing, because they practice in very much a similar way. In fact, one time someone did an article on Kalamazoo, which is the big international medieval congress in the States. And in the article, they mentioned that people were cosplaying there. Well, it was actually a real Benedictine monk that had attended the conference. So there are still people
not cosplaying at all, except, living the life.
So there are people that are living it according to the real St. Benedict still. And I would love to visit one of those places to see how much has changed, or has it not changed, and how they feel about the life that they've chosen to live. And actually, I've been contacted by a few monks and nuns about this book, and they've said really nice things. That is so gratifying, because I wrote it as a secular historian and really wanted to be cognizant of their beliefs. So it was really nice that they read this and felt good about it. So that was good. So I've visited medieval monasteries as ruins, because most of my traveling has been done in England, Scotland. And so we know that Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, and many of them fell into disrepair. But if you go to them, you can see the scale is just immense, and it's absolutely beautiful. The amount of time they put into making it look beautiful, they're stunning. They're stunning. So if you haven't been to one and you find yourself in Europe, there are still lots of them all over the place you can visit, and they're just beautiful.
And I think that is something very important to emphasize about this book, is that it's rooted in a very particular time, and it's the medieval world that you understand so well. I'm often convinced you must close your eyes and the medieval world must just appear around you. But there is also, there's a timelessness to the fact that, as you say, this is a life that is still being lived, and has been in England, obviously, and in other places around Europe. There was this great rupture in the 16th century, but in other places there was absolute continuity. And as you were saying, in Belgium, in some places it's a way of life that then was rerouted. And that sense of continuity and the links between the past and the present, when we're surrounded, as we are, in dark and difficult days, by difficult manifestations of history erupting into the now, there is enormous consolation, I think, to be found in this kind of really thoughtful engagement with how people lived centuries ago.
Yes, thank you for that. It's the continuity that really spoke to me, because I think as humans, our needs are consistent. We need nature. We need moderation. We need, hopefully, a healthy diet. We need exercise if we can manage it. And it was built into monastic life, and we can hopefully build it into our lives as well. But especially this week, with everything just being awful, I was thinking back to this and ways when you have people that are coping with really difficult things. How do they do that? And that's one of the things that really interests me about history in general. But there are things in the book that I think can be helpful to us now. Obviously, that's why I wrote it. And the most important thing, I think, for me, that was life changing, I started in 2017, was meditation. I think that is the most important thing that is good for your mental health. Exercise, we already know about. Good health, healthy eating, we already know about. Meditation, we've discovered, or psychologists have discovered, you can do it like 3 minutes a day, and the benefits will last years. So they've helped people with PTSD and given them like a meditation course over like a month or something, checked in with them a year later, and they're still feeling better. So if I can give people anything, I would say try meditation. It's one of these things where you start talking about and people glaze over, right? And it's just thinking about one thing at a time. So I learned that from reading the Dalai Lama's book. So I came at it from the Tibetan perspective. And he says, just picture one thing. Just picture one thing and come back to it when you get distracted. So for me, it was just picturing a bubble. So meditation doesn't have to be hard, but you can do this as a way that's helpful to you. And thinking really hard about what's happening this week with the world. One of the things that comes up again and again in the book is to think about how you're framing your own narrative about your own life right now. So one of the other most important things, and the easier thing perhaps, is journaling. So write down what's going on with you, because we know from psychological studies now that just naming what you're feeling is going to give you a bit of relief. And I think this is interesting in monastic context because they name their sins, right? So they're like, what is going on with me? Oh, I'm feeling wrath, or I'm feeling pride. And I think this is related to me. I think naming the issue will help. Journaling will help you frame this narrative in a way that makes sense to you, just like it did for monastic chroniclers. So I really think meditation is the way to go. But if you're having difficulty and you want to live like a monk right now, journaling, I think, will be helpful. So maybe try that if you're having a difficult time right now.
And perhaps there's a lovely comment that's come in about what a beautiful object this is, and beautiful paper, and the beautiful illustrations, and so on. And just to remember that beauty and humanity continue to exist in the world, and we can still find them even in a context where they seem harder to reach. And yes, we've got so many appreciative comments coming in. I'm realizing that perhaps I ought to ask you to tell us what the announcement you were going to make is before perhaps Emily could reveal our prize winner.
Right. Okay. So just a couple more minutes, everybody, to tell us what living well means to you with an emoji or one word, so Emily can find you. The announcement is Abbeville Press, and they are an art press, which is why the book looks so beautiful. It's my first picture book. Yeah, here it is. Thanks, Emily. Abbeville.com. That's where you can find the book. They've asked me to write a second book, so I'm writing another book for Abbeville Press, and it's going to be on medieval manners. So this is very exciting to me because I love these human details, like table manners and chivalry. And all of these things I'm going to be talking about them and how they affected the medieval world, how they reflect the medieval world. So there's going to be a new book out next year. I have to write it now, but it's
you've told us all now. We're going to hold you to that. You've got to write it. So that's going to be fascinating because in some ways, I mean, presumably, again, you're going to be thinking about continuities, but presumably there are going to be some ways in which the medieval world is very, very different in terms of manners and assumptions about what politeness is or rudeness is and so on. I mean, it's going to be fascinating. And your research will presumably take you in all sorts of directions.
It's going to be so much fun to research this stuff because I love this stuff. I've come across manners books already, and I never get to talk about them enough in like a broad history, like things like don't wipe your mouth on the tablecloth or your sleeve, things like that. Don't pick your nose at the table. These are consistent human manners. So I'm very excited to dig into that, and also broadly things like chivalry. So it's very exciting.
So worldviews, human interactions. It may not be put your phone away while we're eating, but it'll be the equivalent of that. And we'll get to find out next year what you have to tell us. That is absolutely wonderful news, and I can't wait. It's going to be a wonderful companion piece to this too, I think. But how are we doing? Yeah, lots of congratulations now pouring in. We're all looking forward to it, all of us. I know you've got to do the hard work before then.
Yeah.
Now, do you think is Emily ready to reveal our winners?
Yes, Emily has got the wheel of names going, and the wheel of names is something that Emily has told me about, where she puts everybody's names on like a wheel of fortune, which is very medieval, and spins it. Okay, Emily, spin the wheel of names, and let's see who has won things. She's gonna secretly tell us. Okay, so Jairus 50 or Jaris 50. I'm gonna get Emily to put up my email address so you can get in touch with me. I can send you your book. So I don't know if it's Jairus or Jaris 50, but that is winner number 1 of 3. I think the wheel of names is still spinning. Jessica Withers is number 2. And remember, I can sign this for you or your grandma or your dog, whoever you like. So Jessica Withers is number 2. And yeah, email me and I'll get this to you. And then Carolyn May is number 3 to get the 3rd book. Emily, do you have those comments so we can find out what wellness means to Jaris, Jessica, and Carolyn for us? That would be great. I'm asking a lot. I'm asking a lot. Acceptance. Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think this is one of the things we're talking about, right? Accepting that the difficulties you might have as a monk or as a person right now, really recognizing that. Outdoors. Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about green stuff, right? So outdoors is wellness and peacefulness for Jessica. And then love, of course. Absolutely. And people, I think, may not think about how much they talk about love in monastic sources, but they say love is the most important thing. And I think it's the Anchoran rule again, where it's surprising they're supposed to live such a difficult life. And they say love is more important than how hard you are working at this. If you are loving, that's going to get you to heaven more than anything else. So that's
if your heart is willing and then your human self is trying, that's the best any of us can do to keep love in our hearts and keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to scroll through and see what other people have said is wellness to them. We have acceptance, we have balance, we have terraces, unicorns, we have faith, peacefulness, contentment. Yeah, all of these things, they're mostly in the book. This is what monks wanted from their lives as well. Helen, can you tell us about what you're up to? Because you've been so kind to come on and talk to me about this. Can you tell us what your new project is, or is that?
I can. It's very kind of you to ask. I'm very, very slow at writing it, which is why it's not with us already. As you say, the last 2 years have been a bit challenging. I am writing about 2 kings of England, Richard II and Henry IV. First cousins, almost exactly the same age. One ends up being deposed by the other in very complicated political circumstances. It's not a story with very much acceptance or balance or even love in it at many stages, but it is absolutely fascinating to see what went wrong with Richard's reign, and the last few years politically have been very resonant for me as I've been researching and writing this book about various leaders around the world, with parallels to where Richard went wrong and the difficulties he got himself into, and then the difficulty of how you can remove a leader without breaking the constitution, without breaking everything. So it's a book about power, as opposed to my previous books. It's about male rulers and power rather than, there are very few women in this book actually, one way or another, but I'm loving writing it, and I'm hoping people might want to read it once I finally finish it. But it'll probably be out in, I hope, early 2023, possibly late 2023. Sorry, I've forgotten which year we're in now. 2023. I hope. Centuries come and go when you're a medievalist. It's hard to remember what year we're in. But thank you very much for asking.
Yes. Well, I'm so excited to read it. I think I've read all your books except for the Paston one, which I have on the shelf and I'm going to read next. I can't wait to read it. You're such a great historian, and I think that everyone who reads your books is made better by your history. So I'm really excited about it. And our books will probably come out around the same time, so we should do this again, which would be great.
If you'll have me, I'll be back like a shot. It's been an absolute honor to be part of this, and congratulations. I can't stop holding this up because it's such a wonderful, wonderful read and a beautiful thing. So huge congratulations from across the Atlantic. And when we get the chance, we'll have to raise a toast in person.
Yes, absolutely. So I want to thank you, Helen, for being here and doing this interview. I want to thank Emily Nichols, who's in the background. She's somebody who does public speaking, and she talks about engineering and humanity and how to be a good human while you're actually trying to live in a very technical field. Emily, can you put your website up so people can see your stuff too? I also need to thank Peter Konieczny from medievals.net, who's keeping an eye on comments that might not have popped up and allowing these comments to come up to us. So I want to see Emily's email address in a second, and then we will say goodbye to everybody. Emily's not coming up. Okay. I think it's emilynichols.com, isn't it? emilynichols.com. So do check out her stuff. Helen Castor, you don't have a website, but people can follow you on Twitter, right? At HR Castor. Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It was such a great time. Thanks so much, everybody. See you later.
Thank you for having me. Bye.
Bye.